Hello and welcome to this Blackwell Online podcast. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Emma Larkin. There can be few countries on earth where protest is more stifled and fraught with danger than Burma. Such are the risks of speaking openly that Emma Larkin, author of Everything is Broken, writes about the country under a pseudonym and has changed the names of the people she met there in order to protect their identities. Emma has been visiting Burma now for over 15 years, but the main focus of her book is the past few years, which have seen popular protests by Buddhist monks and a savage crackdown by the military regime, followed by the devastating cyclone Nigris, in the aftermath of which the Burmese authorities severely restricted the access of foreign aid organisations to the country. All the while, they insisted that they had everything under control. Emma describes Rangoon, the former capital, as a city seething with untold stories. So I put it to her that giving voice to those stories was really the purpose behind her book.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked that up, actually, because I think this is the key thing, really, which keeps me going back to Burma and keeps me writing about it. It's this idea of vanishing stories, really, stories that would otherwise disappear. I think. I mean, a combination of the regime's oppression, methods of censorship, and the extreme surveillance that prevails there means that stories really stay only inside people's heads, and they only get told to very trusted friends, family, or colleagues. It's kind of one of my big missions, really, is to try and collect these stories, and it's one of the things I do when I'm there is try and talk to as many people as I possibly can from as many different walks of life as possible. Although this process in itself is very difficult because you have to get people to trust you, obviously, before they're going to entrust you with their story.
Yes, I mean, the impression you get from the book is that people have to be very careful because they could be speaking to an informer or things could be overheard. And so how do you actually get to people's stories and get them to trust you? I've
been going to Burma for about 15, almost over 15 years now, actually. So it's a long, slow process. And I think because I've been going there so long and for so many years, and most of my sources, I mean, they're not just sources anymore, they're friends to me, really. And that's not something you can do very quickly or easily in a place like Burma. It just takes time, and it takes repeated visits, and it takes people trusting me enough. And also the use of a pen name, I think, enables people not to feel that they'll be too exposed when the stories I write or the books I publish come out. So it's sort of multiple tactics that you need to use.
And I mean, on the other side, you've got the information put out by the military regime, which is entirely fictitious and unreliable, isn't it? And that was sort of brought home to me in a sort of absurd moment in the book, where following the cyclone in 2008, they give a precise number of chickens which had been killed in this terrible natural disaster. And it just seemed to me to sort of point up the complete absurdity of record keeping in this regime.
Isn't that wonderful? In all that darkness, that was sort of a moment of absurdity that everyone latched onto as something to laugh at. I think it's a sign. I think this idea of the number of chickens and buffalo and that have been killed, I think it's a sign, a way for the regime to try and claim some kind of omniscience, some sort of all-knowing aspect of this all-powerful regime. Because it's obviously something that can't be known by anybody, no matter how organised or how efficient your government was. I think it would be impossible to say how many small animals had died in a cyclone. But the regime loves useless information, and it loves showing off this useless information in wonderful sort of propaganda publications, like the New Light of Myanmar, which is the state newspaper, and it's published in English. So it's great to read in Burma as an insight into how, not so much what's actually happening, but how the regime sees itself and how the regime wants Burma to be seen. It's not real news or real facts that the regime is peddling. It's fantasy, really, extreme fantasy.
I couldn't help thinking that George Orwell, the subject of an earlier book you wrote, would have sort of recognized the tactics employed by that publication from his own 1984.
Yeah, absolutely. It's as if he scripted the whole thing.
The book opens in the aftermath of that terrible disaster in 2007, the cyclone in the Irrawaddy Delta. And I think the thing which shocked people most, perhaps, beyond the natural disaster, was the absolute resistance of the regime to accept outside help. I mean, what is your explanation for that, the sort of tenacity of their resistance?
I think at the time, everybody was sincerely baffled by that, because it was a natural disaster. It wasn't a disaster that had been caused or even confounded by the regime in that early stage. So the regime would have had no international condemnation for what had happened. But there's always this very protective mechanism and a sort of veering on extreme paranoia, in which the regime will not allow outsiders to meddle in its affairs in any way. And this is one of the reasons we know so little about the regime, because it is so closed off from the rest of the world and so isolated and so paranoid that really there isn't very much interaction with the outside world. So when the outside world came with offers of help after Cyclone Nargis struck, they were viewed with suspicion, I think. People, governments and NGOs and private donors that wanted to help were just viewed with suspicion.
And I suppose one of the big questions that you're pursuing in this book is how this regime functions. What makes this military regime tick? How does it hold together? How does it operate? How difficult is it to get a fix on that question?
Unfortunately, this is one of the great unanswerables about Burma, I think. Because the regime is so closed off and because there's so little access, most of the information we have about the internal workings of the regime is anecdotal. And it will, by the time it gets to somebody like me, say, it's probably at least second, if not third or fourth hand information. So all the best we can do in the terms of regime is intelligent speculation at what drives the regime. And there are a number of things that we can see, such as this paranoia, I think this extreme protectiveness, this suspicion, xenophobia, fear of the outside world. Astrology is another interesting strand that is quite visible, actually, even in day-to-day life in Burma.
Yeah, I was really struck by that every military leader has his own pet astrologer, and numerology plays a big part in any decisions that are made. It's quite eye-opening, really shocking.
Yeah, but I've thought about this a lot, and I don't want it to be portrayed so much as that there's this sort of lunatic, irrational streak in them, that they would rely on astrologers or fortune tellers, because it's a countrywide phenomenon. I mean, the Burmese are obsessed, as with many people actually in Southeast Asia, are obsessed with fortune tellers. And even we in the West, we read our astrological signs every day, don't we, in the newspaper and things like that. So it's not so much an irrational streak, I think, as part of what Burmese society is. And if you take in the added fact of the isolation of the generals, I think, rather than relying on international mechanisms or international ideals of governance, they rely on the old ways, which is astrologers, which is how the old kings of Burma used to work too. There was an astrological department, in the court, which they would rely on.
And there's more than a hint of the old kings of Burma in many things the regime does. There's sort of quite a self-conscious aping of some of the trappings of Burmese kingship, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. Even in this very the surprise move of the capital to Naypyidaw, which took place some years ago, and again, like many of the regime's actions, took most people by surprise. And it's in the tradition of the old kings of Burma that with the new dynasty, a new capital will be founded. And so that's how most people interpret the new capital in Burma as Than Shwe, the senior general, following in the footsteps of the warrior kings.